One broken man, one wounded officer buried in snow, and one old dog who still remembered what duty meant. A brutal storm was tearing through Colorado's mountain pass. Most people stayed inside, but not him, not Ranger. He heard the whisper no one else did, a whisper that led to a half-frozen cop barely breathing beneath a twisted pine. What happened next, between a retired doctor, a forgotten hero, and a canine with eyes like steel, will restore your faith in loyalty, in healing, and in second chances. But before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you believe no one should be left behind, not soldier, not dog, not soul, hit that subscribe button. Because this is the kind of story that doesn't just stay in your memory, it stays in your heart. Snow Creek, Colorado, was the kind of town that vanished on most maps. Too small to matter to tourists, too stubborn to surrender to time. Nestled at the foot of the San Juan Mountains, it existed more as a memory than a destination. On this particular night, the town lay buried beneath a furious blizzard, the kind of storm that closed roads, silenced radios, and reminded every living soul just how fragile warmth could be. The wind howled through narrow alleys, slamming against shuttered windows. Snow fell in wild spirals, not gently, but with purpose, blinding, biting, relentless. Street lamps flickered under the weight of accumulating ice, casting pale halos across empty sidewalks. The only sound beyond the storm's rage was the creak of pines bending under white weight. Outside of town, a mile past the last flickering porch light, an old cabin sat hunched beneath the storm like an aging sentinel. Its wooden shingles groaned under the gusts, and the roof had long surrendered to the season's heaviness. But within, a fire burned low, and a man sat hunched over a worn leather journal. Dr. Samuel Reed, 66, looked nothing like the brilliant trauma surgeon he once was. His once black hair had turned a soft steel gray, cropped short in military precision. A clean-lined beard, kept neatly trimmed, framed his face, now drawn and hollowed by loss. His shoulders were broad but sloped with time, his hands still steady but slower now, and his gait betrayed the stiffness of a man who'd spent too many years standing over operating tables and not enough walking freely beneath trees. He wore a dark green flannel and thick wool trousers, layers for warmth more than style. His eyes, a pale hazel, were sharp even behind reading glasses, but dulled slightly tonight, not from age, but from memory. He had moved to this cabin 3 winters ago, after his wife Margaret passed unexpectedly from an aneurysm. Her death had carved something out of him, something words hadn't yet rebuilt. Tonight, he was rereading her journals. They were filled with gentle thoughts, sketches of plants from their shared garden back in Portland, and quotes she had copied over and over, as if inscribing them into time. Samuel flipped to the final page, one he had never dared open until now. Her handwriting, so familiar it made his chest ache, read, "If the wind brings something to your door, don't turn it away. Even the storms carry souls." He stared at the sentence for a long time, lips parted, as if expecting her to whisper something more from the other side of the silence. Then, without warning, Ranger stood. The German shepherd had been lying quietly by the hearth, his head on his paws, ears twitching at each crackle of the fire. But now, he rose with urgency, his ears angled sharply toward the window, his amber eyes fixed on something unseen. Ranger was 9 years old, his black and tan coat streaked with gray along the muzzle and hips. He moved with a slight limp from an old hip fracture earned during a Snow Lodge rescue in Wyoming, but age hadn't dulled his senses. He was still all instinct, all purpose. His frame was powerful, lean from years in service. Trained in avalanche rescue and missing person search, Ranger had once saved 2 children buried beneath a collapsed ski cabin. Since then, he had retired with Samuel, not because he couldn't work, but because Samuel needed him. Tonight, Ranger did not bark. He simply walked to the front door, nose high, body alert. Samuel watched him, heart suddenly uneasy. "What is it, boy?" Ranger turned his head slightly and let out a low, insistent whine. Outside, the wind screamed again, high and shrill like something alive. And maybe it was. Samuel stood slowly, spine cracking with effort, and walked to the door. He opened it carefully, and the cold slammed into the room like a ghost. Wind and snow burst through, scattering papers, flickering the fire low. But Ranger was already gone. A blur of fur and muscle, he leapt down the steps and vanished into the blizzard. "Ranger!" Samuel shouted into the white wall. His voice was instantly swallowed. He stood there, paralyzed, staring into the blinding snow. Somewhere out there, something had called, and Ranger, faithful, stubborn Ranger, had answered. Samuel closed the door, turned back toward the fire. The room felt colder now, even with the flames. He looked again at the journal in his hand, at that line his wife had written. "If the wind brings something to your door." His fingers trembled as he gently closed the book. Then he walked to the closet, pulled on his long winter coat, scarf, and boots. He grabbed the emergency flashlight and a thermal blanket. He wasn't young anymore, but some instincts didn't age. The wind tore through the forest with a sound like a scream muffled by cloth. Long, aching, and never quite human. Pines swayed violently, snow falling from their limbs in heavy sudden bursts that vanished into the deepening drifts. Samuel pushed forward, his flashlight bouncing in his grip, slicing a narrow path of yellow light through the blizzard. He kept his eyes low, focused on the paw prints Ranger had left behind. Clear, urgent, unwavering, now quickly vanishing under fresh snow. The woods north of Snow Creek were known for their beauty in the spring, with wildflowers lining creeks and elk calls echoing through the dusk. But in winter, especially a winter like this, they turned into something wilder. The trees crowded together as if to block out the sky, and the air itself seemed to carry a weight. Samuel's breaths came fast and shallow, turning to fog before disappearing, the cold cutting through every layer he wore. "Ranger!" he shouted, but the wind devoured his voice. His boots sank deep into snow, his knees burning, his body protesting every step. And still, he kept going. The prince led down a slope, toward a gully where the snow had drifted strangely high. There, Ranger's tracks circled, back and forth, in tight, deliberate loops, like the dog was searching, then stopping. Samuel stumbled down the last few feet, nearly falling to his knees as his flashlight beam caught movement, a shadow against the white. Ranger stood there, statuesque, alert, tail stiff, head lowered, guarding something. Samuel approached carefully, eyes adjusting to the uneven terrain. The flashlight flicked across a mound of snow, half-collapsed branches, and something dark nestled in between. He dropped to one knee, brushed snow aside with his gloves, and froze. A man, face down, partially buried, young, maybe late 20s or early 30s. Snow clung to his lashes and eyebrows, caked his collar, filled the cracks in his cracked lips. His dark patrol jacket was nearly torn from one shoulder, exposing raw skin already pale and stiff. One arm was twisted beneath him, but the other, his right, was clenched tightly around the grip of a sidearm, the muzzle pressed to his chest. Samuel's stomach clenched. This man wasn't just lost. He had been holding his post. "Jesus," Samuel whispered, brushing away more snow. He turned the flashlight toward the man's face, angling it to avoid blinding. His skin had gone blotchy, pale with hints of blue, lips chapped, jawline dusted with a few days of stubble. His hair was dark and matted, frozen at the ends. He was handsome, in the way young soldiers always were, hardened too early by things no one should carry. Samuel placed two gloved fingers against the man's neck, near the carotid artery. He waited. A long pause, then, there, a flutter, faint but real. "He's alive," Samuel said, exhaling for the first time in what felt like hours. Ranger let out a soft whimper, pressing his nose gently to the man's arm. The man didn't move. Samuel began to check for injuries. His shoulder was clearly dislocated or worse. Dark bruising spread across the torn sleeve, and blood had frozen into the fabric. His ribs seemed intact, but he was ice cold, likely hypothermic. And then Samuel noticed something else. Peeking out from beneath the jacket's flap was the corner of a folded, weathered photo, edges curled, image stained with time and snow. Samuel hesitated only a moment before gently retrieving it. The photo was small, faded, but still clear. Two young boys, maybe 10 or 11, standing side by side in matching t-shirts, arms slung around each other. One had a tooth missing, the other, dimples too deep to ignore. The words written on the back in childish block letters read, "Liam and Jake, together we live, together we protect." Samuel stared at the name. Jake. He looked again at the man, still young, still fighting, even now. "Well, Jake," Samuel murmured, tucking the photo carefully back inside the jacket. "Looks like your brother would want me to get you home." Ranger shifted and gave a low, deep bark. Not a warning, but a call to act. He backed away slightly, leaving space. Samuel looked around. The terrain wasn't ideal, steep, slippery, and only getting worse with the storm thickening. But he'd dealt with worse in operating rooms, and with far less time. He began gathering fallen branches and his tarp from the pack he carried, starting the frame of a makeshift sled. But for now, for just a moment longer, he knelt beside the wounded officer. Jake McAllister, a man who refused to drop his weapon even when death reached for him. A man with a twin brother, and a promise written in ink that still hadn't faded. The snow fell heavier now, blanketing them all. Samuel placed a hand on Jake's good shoulder, just briefly. "You held on," he said. "Now it's my turn." The cabin had never felt so alive. Firelight flickered wildly across the pine-planked walls, casting dancing shadows that played across the ceiling. The air was thick with steam rising from a pot of broth, and the faint scent of burnt cedar clung to everything. Snow thudded softly against the window panes like a ghost trying to get in. But inside, it was a different world, one of fuel breath held, of quiet urgency, of two men on opposite edges of life. Samuel knelt by the hearth, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, hands steady despite the cold ache in his joints. Jake lay motionless on the woolen rug, the emergency blanket wrapped around his body like armor. His pulse was still erratic, his breathing labored, but he was here. He had a chance. The blood had crusted along the torn flesh of Jake's shoulder. Samuel cleaned it gently with warm water, muttering reassurances not meant for the man, but for his own nerves. Then came the sutures. The needle moved with surprising precision. Samuel's hands still remembered, even if his heart had forgotten what it felt like to care. The gash took 14 stitches. The bruised rib, he wrapped tight with gauze and linen. His fingers grazed a thin scar already present under Jake's ribs, old and puckered. Not his first wound. Not his first war either, probably. Ranger lay curled beside the wounded man, chin resting near Jake's elbow, golden brown eyes tracking Samuel's every move. Occasionally, the old dog would shift slightly, ears flicking toward the window as if making sure no danger lingered outside. He didn't sleep. He didn't whine. He simply stood watch. Samuel stood slowly, feeling the stiffness in his knees and lower back like a long overdue reminder of time past. He glanced at the old oak cupboard above the fireplace, a cabinet he hadn't touched in 7 years. The last time he had opened it had been the night before Margaret's aneurysm, when she'd asked for extra gauze after slicing her hand on a broken dish. After her death, he had locked it and never returned. Now, something inside him shifted. He moved to it, pulled a small brass key from a nail beneath the shelf, and unlocked the cabinet. Inside was a meticulously organized array of supplies, bottles of antiseptics, painkillers, suture kits, thermometers, gloves, even a stethoscope still coiled in its case. Margaret had once joked it looked more like a hospital cart than a mountain home. He pulled down what he needed and returned to Jake's side, carefully checking temperature, heart rate, and breathing. It wasn't ideal, but it was enough. When everything was done, he ladled broth into a ceramic bowl and set it near the fire to cool. Then he sat beside the man and the dog and simply waited. The fire snapped. Outside, the wind hissed beneath the eaves. Inside, Jake shifted. A slight twitch in his fingers, a flutter of eyelid. Samuel leaned forward. "Easy now," he murmured. "You're safe." Jake's eyes cracked open, unfocused at first. His lips parted, voice a sandpaper rasp. "Liam?" Samuel blinked. "No, not Liam." Jake blinked again, confusion swimming in his gaze. He tried to rise, but his body betrayed him. He groaned in pain. "Lie still," Samuel said firmly, placing a hand on Jake's good shoulder. "You're lucky to be alive. Your dog found you." Jake's gaze drifted to Ranger, who lifted his head slightly, tail tapping once. "That's not my dog," Jake whispered. Samuel raised a brow. "Could have fooled me." Jake chuckled, weak and broken. "Guess I owe him then." They said nothing for a moment, just the sound of the fire. "I'm Samuel," the older man said finally. "Doctor, retired. This is my cabin. That's Ranger." Jake nodded slightly, wincing. "Jake McAllister, officer. I think I was tracking someone." "You can tell me more later," Samuel said, rising to fetch the broth. He returned, kneeling and holding a spoonful near Jake's lips. "Can you swallow?" Jake nodded. Slowly, painfully, he drank, bit by bit. "Why'd you come out for me?" he asked after a pause. Samuel looked at him. There was no grand answer, no easy one. "Because my dog ran into the storm, and because my wife once wrote something about listening to the wind." Jake's eyes drifted shut again, but a faint smile played across his mouth. That night, long after the cabin had quieted, and Jake was asleep once more, his breath steadier, his color returning, Samuel sat at the edge of his bed, staring at the fire. Ranger slept now, for real, curled beside the hearth. Samuel felt the weight of the day settle deep into his bones. He poured a glass of scotch, untouched for years, and set it on the table without drinking. The flames cast gold across the photograph still resting on the shelf, the one of him and Margaret, taken the year before she passed. He closed his eyes. In the haze between waking and sleep, he saw himself walking through the forest. Not the man he was now, but younger, surer, and beside him, not Margaret, but Jake. And for the first time in years, Samuel dreamed. The fire had burned low in the hearth, leaving a soft orange glow that pulsed against the log walls like the last heartbeat of a dying star. Snow tapped the windows gently now, the storm having loosened its grip on the land. A fragile silence wrapped around the cabin like a wool blanket, one stitched from exhaustion, fading pain, and the weight of something unspoken. Jake stirred. It began with a twitch in his fingers, a shallow breath, and then a violent gasp that shattered the quiet. His eyes flew open, not calm, but wild, the way a man wakes in the middle of a war zone, unsure if he's still in danger or just dreaming of it. He bolted upright with a groan, pain lighting up every muscle like fire. His right hand, stiff with cold and instinct, reached blindly for the weapon that was no longer there. Samuel, seated nearby in the worn armchair with a cup of cold tea in hand, didn't move. He'd seen this before, in field hospitals, in waiting rooms, in his own mirror once. Panic was part of waking up. "Easy," he said quietly. "You're safe. You're in my cabin. You were unconscious in the snow." Jake's chest heaved. His eyes scanned the room, wide and untrusting. His shoulder was heavily bandaged, but his body didn't seem to acknowledge that it couldn't fight anymore. Then his gaze landed on Ranger. The old German shepherd had lifted his head the moment Jake stirred. He didn't bark, didn't growl. He simply rose on his haunches and stepped forward, movement smooth but measured. With a solemn grace, Ranger placed his head gently against Jake's outstretched arm, the one not swathed in gauze. Jake froze. The room stood still with him. The dog's breath warmed the chilled skin of Jake's forearm. His eyes, deep amber and wise beyond any natural age, met Jake's and held. Something cracked inside the young man, not loudly, not like breaking glass, but softly, like frost yielding to sunrise. His arm dropped slowly, fingers loosening. His eyes, still too wide, blinked and filled with something heavier than fear. He let out a shaky breath and whispered, "I thought I was already gone." Ranger didn't move. He stayed pressed close, as though he had done this 1,000 times. Samuel rose finally and moved to the small table nearby. He poured a glass of water, brought it over, and handed it to Jake. The younger man took it with trembling fingers. "You almost were," Samuel said. "Another hour, and you'd have frozen where you lay." Jake sipped, nodded. His voice was hoarse. "How did you find me?" "I didn't," Samuel said. He glanced at Ranger. "He did." Jake looked at the dog again, his brow furrowed, like something in him didn't quite believe it. "He's not mine." "He is now," Samuel said simply. Jake attempted a smile, but it never reached his eyes. As the silence settled again, Samuel moved to gather some blankets and prop up Jake's head. He caught sight of the torn jacket lying nearby and paused. From its half-open breast pocket, a small black notebook peeked out. He picked it up gently, intending to set it aside, but something on the edge caught his attention. The edge of a page dog-eared and smudged with ink. With hesitant fingers, he flipped it open. No dates, no tactical notes, no coordinates. Poems, fragments, half-thoughts, ink stained by weather and time. The handwriting was careful in some places, rushed in others, but the voice that emerged from the page was young, wounded, and deeply human. "Liam, I still hear you in the quiet. I make coffee for two without thinking. I'm still scared to walk into the room you're not in. I haven't gone home because it doesn't know me anymore. Samuel blinked. He hadn't expected poetry, not from a man who gripped a sidearm while unconscious, not from a face so sharp-edged with pain. Jake noticed him holding it and tried to sit straighter. You read it? Samuel closed the notebook slowly. Just a little. Jake didn't respond for a moment. Then softly, it's the only thing I kept from the hospital. That and the photo. The one with Liam? Samuel asked. Jake nodded. My twin. We were cops together. I made it out. He didn't. Samuel offered no sympathy, no platitudes, just a simple nod, the kind a man gives when he's seen enough grief to know it needs no narration. Grief makes ghosts of the living, he said, but poetry makes them speak. Jake looked down. Did you lose someone? Samuel looked toward the old armchair by the fire. A folded shawl still rested across its back. Margaret's shawl. He hadn't touched it in 3 years. My wife, he said. Aneurysm. No warning. She died before the tea finished steeping. Jake looked up sharply. I'm sorry. Samuel gave a dry smile. Don't be. It was long ago. Long enough that I stopped waiting for her voice. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was oddly restful. Like two strangers on opposite ends of a storm had found the same patch of ground and chosen just for a while not to move. Ranger finally curled beside the hearth again, resting his head on his paws. His ears twitched once, but he didn't open his eyes. Jake leaned back on the pile of pillows, exhaling like someone who hadn't really let air into his lungs in days. I didn't think anyone would find me out there, he murmured. You weren't just anyone, Samuel said. You were someone the wind was willing to carry. Jake gave him a puzzled look. Samuel turned toward the fire. Never mind, just something my wife once wrote. Morning crept into the cabin like a ghost, quiet, colorless, with light the texture of fog. Snow still pressed against the windows, soft and weighty, but the storm had passed, leaving behind a silence that felt less threatening now, more like a breath held in anticipation. Samuel stood at the far side of the cabin, staring at the narrow shelf above the hearth. Tucked beneath a layer of dust and an old oil lantern sat a radio, heavy, rust-streaked, military-grade, a relic from another era. It hadn't been touched in over a decade. He reached up, fingers brushing against the cold metal, and pulled it down. The device thudded gently against the table. He blew across its face, watching dust rise like a memory. The dial was cracked but intact. A few wires dangled from the side, the antenna bent but not broken. Jake, still propped up on the couch and wrapped in the thermal blanket, lifted his head. That thing still work? Samuel gave him a sideways look. It's older than both of us, but these old models were built for war zones. You'd be surprised what they can outlive. He plugged it into a portable power cell he kept for emergencies and clicked the dial. For a long moment, there was nothing, just dead air. Then a flicker of static, sharp and sudden, like the crackle of old vinyl. Samuel adjusted the frequency, turning knobs with careful precision until a low hum settled into the room. Ranger, lying by the stove with one paw crossed over the other, lifted his head slightly but didn't move. Samuel pressed the mic and spoke, his voice steady. This is Dr. Samuel Reed at Snow Creek Ridge. I have a wounded officer recovered from the forest. Repeat. Officer down, requesting immediate medical extraction. Coordinates. He read them aloud slowly, then released the button. Jake watched him closely, his expression unreadable. Think they'll come? Samuel asked after a moment. Jake didn't answer right away. He leaned forward slowly, grimacing at the pull in his bandaged shoulder. His hand went instinctively to the notebook, now resting in the crook of the couch. I don't know, he said finally. It depends who hears that. Samuel raised an eyebrow. Meaning? Jake exhaled. Before I got lost out there, I was tracking someone. Narcotics, weapons, interstate trafficking ring. Quiet, fast, buried deep. We had a leak in the department, someone feeding our positions to the wrong people. Samuel folded his arms. So, if they intercepted your last known location, they might be listening, Jake finished. If they pick up your signal, they won't send a rescue team. They'll send someone else. The room went still again. Ranger rose now, padding toward the table where the radio sat, ears alert. He stared at the machine as if expecting it to answer for itself. Samuel turned to the window. The snow reflected the light harshly, but the forest beyond looked deceptively peaceful. Just pines, still and heavy with white. But the idea of wolves hiding behind trees wasn't new. He'd seen enough of the world to know the worst men didn't wear uniforms or growl when they stalked you. "I suppose I could try shortwave civilian band instead," Samuel muttered, already adjusting the dial. "Keep it low, just enough to ping." Jake gave a faint nod. "If help's out there, better they know before the wrong people do." They worked in silence for a while. Jake provided what little intel he had, details about the route he took, the last transmission he made, where he believed the leak started. Samuel jotted it down in a notepad with a surgeon's neat hand. But eventually, Jake's attention wandered. His eyes drifted toward the bookshelf in the corner of the room. An old, heavy thing made of cedar, sagging under the weight of years. Among the spines was a faded red binder. Something about it drew his focus. "What's that?" he asked, nodding. Samuel turned, then followed Jake's gaze. A strange softness passed over his features. He walked over, retrieved the binder, and handed it to Jake. "It was my wife's," he said. "Margaret. She was a field nurse and crisis counselor. Used to volunteer at shelters, safe houses, clinics, the kind of places you don't talk about over coffee." Jake opened it. Inside were laminated notes, old maps, and scribbled messages. But tucked between the pages was something unexpected. A children's drawing, faded, crayon on cheap paper. Two stick figures stood under a crooked tree, one taller than the other. Above them, written in bold letters, "Thank you for saving me." Jake blinked. "Who drew this?" Samuel shrugged. "She said it came from a boy she found hiding under a burned trailer. She never told me his name. She just said he couldn't stop shaking." Jake stared at the drawing for a long time. "I had a memory like that," he said quietly. "Once. I don't know if it was real or if I dreamed it after the fire." Samuel's brow furrowed. "A fire?" Jake nodded slowly. "When Liam and I were 10, our mom left us alone a lot. One night, the space heater caught the curtain. I don't remember much, just smoke, screaming, crawling. Then someone was pulling me out. I remember soft hands and a voice telling me not to be afraid. I always thought it was my brother." Samuel sat down slowly across from him. "And you said Liam didn't make it?" Jake's face tightened. "No, he did. He was with me until just last year. He died in the line of duty." He paused, brow creasing deeper. "But maybe I misremembered. Maybe it wasn't Liam who pulled me out that night." The binder lay open between them. The drawing faced the ceiling, as if daring one of them to name the truth. Samuel rubbed his jaw. "If that boy was you, then my wife saved your life long before Ranger and I did." Jake chuckled softly, though it didn't quite hide the emotion rising in his throat. Maybe this cabin's always been more than just wood and fire. Ranger wandered over then, pressing his head gently into Jake's leg, eyes warm with a knowing that defied logic. Jake leaned down and whispered, "Tell me you didn't know all along." Ranger didn't answer, of course, but he didn't have to. The forest breathed cold that night. By the time twilight had fallen across Snow Creek, the cabin lay cloaked in a blue hush. The wind had quieted to a low sigh, but the stillness carried tension like a held breath. Samuel moved from window to window, checking latches and drawing curtains. The earlier pulse of the radio had gone silent, replaced now by something worse, the anticipation of silence breaking. Jake sat near the fireplace, one arm still in a sling, pistol resting loosely in his lap. His face looked sharper in the low light, eyes darker, mouth thinner, every sense pulled taut. He wasn't resting anymore. He was waiting. Ranger paced near the front door, low growls rumbling occasionally in his chest. His ears flicked to every sound, branches shifting in the wind, the far-off hoot of an owl, the creak of settling wood. 9 years old, but tonight he moved like a much younger dog, each step deliberate and alert. Then came the sound. Not loud, not close, but unmistakable. A single gunshot rang out in the woods beyond the ridge, flat, controlled. Not a hunter's wild shot, but a warning or a signal. Ranger barked once, sharp, deep, and then bolted toward the door. "Wait!" Samuel shouted, but it was too late. The door flung open with a gust of cold air, and the German shepherd vanished into the darkness without hesitation. Samuel and Jake froze. A moment passed, then two. Nothing but wind and the distant groan of pine trees. Jake stood, slower than he liked, his shoulder throbbing from the sudden motion. "We need to bolt this place down." Samuel didn't argue. They moved quickly, securing the windows, barricading the side door, snuffing out unnecessary lights. Inside, the cabin grew darker, the only illumination a narrow band of flame flickering from the hearth. The heat from the stove mingled with the chill of nerves. "I've heard that shot before," Jake muttered as he moved to the rear window, peering into the trees. "That's their way of saying, 'We're here, come find us.'" Samuel checked the front latch again, or that someone didn't make it back. They worked in silence, interrupted only by the sound of boots on wood and the occasional crack of something settling on the roof. Jake's breaths came tight and short. He hated waiting, and it showed. His jaw clenched, his shoulders coiled like a trap. Then, just as suddenly as he had vanished, Ranger returned. The door rattled once, a soft scratch at the bottom panel. Samuel moved quickly and opened it just a crack, just enough to let the dog in. Ranger stumbled through, body low, breathing fast. His left shoulder was slick with blood. A thin gash, long but not deep, stretched across his flank. "Damn it," Samuel whispered, kneeling beside him. "You went after someone." But it wasn't just blood Ranger brought back. Clutched between his teeth was a small, black, metallic object, roughly the size of a coin, but shaped like a flattened dart. Samuel took it gently and placed it on the table. Jake leaned over it and frowned. "That's a tracker," he said. "Encrypted. Military grade. You don't buy these on the street. You inherit them, or you're sent by someone who can." Samuel cleaned Ranger's wound in silence, while Jake disassembled the device, fingers surprisingly nimble, despite the stiffness in his side. After several minutes, Jake set it down with a grim expression. "Whoever they sent, he's not freelance. He's trained." Samuel poured antiseptic over a rag and pressed it gently to Ranger's side. The dog flinched but didn't move away. "I'll patch this, buddy," he murmured, voice softening. "But no more solo missions tonight." Then, from outside, a crunch of snow. Both men froze. A knock followed, deliberate, calm. Samuel stood, motioned Jake toward the side hallway. Jake obeyed, taking position behind the stove. Samuel approached the door, hand on the rifle propped beside it. "Who is it?" he called through the wood. A pause. Then a familiar voice answered, calm, female, unmistakable. "It's Sarah." Samuel exhaled hard. He cracked the door and peeked out. Sarah Dunham stood bundled in 3 layers of thick flannel and denim, her graying blonde hair pinned in a knot beneath a wool cap. She was in her early 60s, tall and wiry, with a face lined by years of wind and solitude. Her eyes, light blue and sharp as shattered glass, missed little. A widow of nearly a decade, Sarah had lived alone at the edge of the valley, half a mile down the trail. She was holding a lantern, boots half buried in the snow, breath fogging in the cold. "I heard a shot," she said simply, "and the dogs went nuts. Thought I'd come check." Samuel opened the door wider. "You're braver than most." "I'm too stubborn to scare easy," she replied and stepped inside. The warmth hit her, and she paused, eyes adjusting to the low light. When she saw Jake, her brows lifted. "I know you," she said. "Jake McAllister." Jake looked up, surprised. "Do I know you?" "No," Sarah said, setting the lantern down, "but I knew Grace." The name landed like a stone. Jake stood slowly. "Grace?" "She was my tenant. Years ago," Sarah continued, walking slowly to the fire. "I helped her get clean, watched her try to rebuild. She never talked about much, except for a kid she left behind. Said she had dreams of going back to find him when it was safe. Your name came up once. Jake." Jake sat back down, speechless, his fingers curled around the notebook in his lap. Samuel turned to her. "Why now, Sarah?" Sarah looked toward the window. "Because sometimes the past sends its shadows when the world gets too quiet. And tonight, it was too quiet." The storm had passed, leaving a glassy hush over Snow Creek's forest. Pine needles sparkled beneath frost, and sunlight filtered through the branches like quiet applause. The world looked clean, sterile even, but Jake knew better. Evil didn't leave tracks in the snow. It burrowed, hid, waited. Inside the cabin, Jake leaned heavily on the table, his shoulders still bound, breath catching with every shift of weight. The fabric of his borrowed flannel shirt stuck to his skin where the bandages bled through. His jaw was tight, eyes focused on the signal device Ranger had unearthed. Samuel sat across from him, fidgeting with the old shortwave radio again, though the hum of static was all it offered. Ranger, the 6-year-old German Shepherd K9, rested at Jake's feet, eyes alert despite the long gash across his shoulder. The dog hadn't barked since returning from the woods the night before. He simply watched the door, as if still waiting for something to crawl out of the dark. The radio crackled to life with a high-pitched blip. Jake stood straighter. That's not interference. That's a ping. Samuel tilted his head. You're sure? Jake didn't answer. He was already pulling the coordinates. The tracker retrieved from the would-be assassin had resumed sending data after being warmed beside the stove. Now, it blinked with a faint green pulse, pointing to a location just 5 miles northeast. That's him, Jake said. The one we missed. The reason this started. Do you think he's still out there? Samuel asked. Jake's voice dropped. If he's smart, he never left. They contacted the DEA through the burner frequency again. Within 40 minutes, the sky thundered with the approach of a black helicopter. Snow exploded into the air as it landed in the clearing beyond the cabin. Ranger stood and limped toward the porch as the team deployed. 6 operatives moved quickly, rifles secured, footsteps silent. At their front strode Agent Claire Redding, a woman in her early 40s with an athletic build and sandy blonde braid tucked beneath her tactical helmet. Her green eyes were precise, scanning without panic. Years in the U.S. Marshal Service and DEA had carved a hardened edge into her, but she never carried herself like a war machine, more like a hawk, swift and thoughtful. She approached the porch, her voice low but sharp. Jake McAllister, you look like hell. Jake offered a lopsided grin. You always had a way with compliments. Claire nodded once, then glanced at Ranger. Is that? Jake's tone softened. Yeah, he found me, saved me. Claire knelt briefly, placing a gloved hand on Ranger's neck. Still carrying the team, huh, boy? Then, without wasting another second, she gestured to her team. Signal says 5 clicks northeast. We go silent and split formation at the western ridge. Go fast, Jake added. He won't stay buried for long. They vanished into the trees, boots making almost no sound on the icy earth. Jake didn't sit. He stood near the window, watching the woods, hand resting just above his holster. Ranger remained pressed against the doorframe. A long hour passed. Then, 2 sharp bursts from the tree line, followed by a third. Minutes later, a call came through Samuel's radio, Agent Redding's voice low and even. Target detained. Repeat. Target in custody. No casualties. Coordinates confirmed. Jake exhaled. Not relief. Not yet. Just the weight of vengeance turning into something else. Responsibility, maybe. The man they caught was Victor Solano, the very one Jake and Liam had been tracking for over a year. Mid-40s, gaunt, with deep creases across his forehead and eyes that never blinked long. Solano had once run shipments through abandoned mining routes near Snow Creek, blending in with the local terrain like a ghost. He was the one who'd orchestrated the ambush that cost Liam his life. When they escorted him past the cabin, Claire paused beside Jake. Got anything you want to say? She asked. Jake stepped forward, his body trembling from pain, fatigue, and fire unburned. I do, he said, voice raw. I want to testify. Claire's brow lifted. You're not required. Jake cut her off. I know, but I need to. He turned to Solano, who stared at him with vacant disdain. For Liam, Jake said, louder now, and for all the names you erased without ever learning, you'll rot with every one of them staring back at you. Victor said nothing, but Jake didn't need a reaction. Later that evening, with the cabin quiet again, Samuel moved alone to the end of the hall. His hand hovered over a door he hadn't touched in 10 years. The room had belonged to his wife, Margaret, a nurse, a caregiver, a woman whose smile could disarm grief itself. The hinges groaned as he opened it. The room remained frozen in time. A scarf still hung over the mirror. Books sat waiting on the nightstand. The smell of dried lavender clung to the air. On the desk lay a single envelope, unsealed. Samuel stepped closer, his hands trembling as he lifted the paper. If I don't come back, promise me something. Don't just keep the door shut and wait for time to forgive you. If you ever find someone who's lost, truly lost, show them how to come back. Raise them to be braver than you, better than me. He sat down in the old rocking chair and read the words again. Outside, the sun dipped behind the ridge, but inside the cabin, for the first time in a decade, the shadows didn't feel so heavy. Morning light spilled over Snow Creek like a benediction. The storm's jagged scars had softened beneath layers of fresh snow, and the world, once again, looked like it had taken a breath. The cabin stood quiet under a frost-tipped roof, smoke curling lazily from the chimney. A wooden sign, newly erected and still smelling of pine, caught the first rays of the sun. Its letters, carved deep and clean, read, "Here, no one is left behind, not even the spirits whispering through the wind." Inside, warmth pulsed gently from the fire. Jake McAllister, now fully upright and no longer favoring his shoulder, was rinsing a tin cup beneath the pump sink. His movements were steady, sure, though a faint line remained above his brow, the mark of someone who had looked death in the eye and chosen to stay. Ranger lay on a woolen rug nearby, his black and tan fur glistening under the window light. The long cut on his flank had healed into a clean, pale scar. He was slower now, padding softly when he rose, but he missed no detail. Every distant owl, every shift of snow beyond the window pane. He was still a guardian. Samuel stood at the workbench, measuring lengths of reclaimed wood with a craftsman's precision. His shoulders had straightened in recent days, his eyes clearer. In his flannel shirt, rolled to the elbows, and worn jeans dusted in sawdust, he looked not like the man who had once disappeared into grief, but someone reborn in purpose. They had spoken little that morning. Words, in the quiet that had returned to the cabin, often felt unnecessary. Finally, Jake set the cup aside and turned. "I've been thinking," he said, voice low. Samuel didn't look up from the plane in his hand. "That's always dangerous." Jake smiled. "I want to stay. Not just rest, not just heal. I mean, stay, work, build something." Samuel paused. "There's not much here except trees and ghosts." "Exactly," Jake replied. "That's why it needs to be something else. Something for the ones like me, the ones who've got nowhere left to go after the mission ends." He crossed to the table and unfurled a piece of parchment he'd drawn on late into the night. It showed a layout, a rough blueprint for a long structure beside the cabin. Heated kennels, a supply shed, a meeting space, space for dogs, and people, and healing. "I want to call it the Quiet Ones," Jake said, "for every canine like Ranger that was sent home broken, for the handlers who came back but never really did, for the ones nobody knows how to help." Samuel stared at the parchment, eyes scanning each line, each annotation. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he set down the plane, stepped to the coat rack, and pulled from the hook an old iron key. "Then you'll need this," he said. "It opens the barn. Been shut for years. You'll have to chase out the raccoons." Jake laughed, a sound unfamiliar on his own tongue. Samuel's eyes glinted. "But it'll hold enough lumber to start." Outside, Ranger rose to his feet and limped to the door. Jake followed, grabbing his coat. Snow crunched beneath their boots and paws as they stepped onto the porch. Together, they descended into the field beyond, where the barn waited. Its red paint faded, but its frame unbowed. Later that afternoon, Sarah arrived with a sack of fresh supplies. She was a tall, wiry woman in her late 60s, with high cheekbones and gray-streaked hair, always pulled into a tight bun. Once a schoolteacher, Sarah had grown quieter after losing her husband to a stroke in the winter of 2008. She wore grief like an old scarf, woven into her identity, but never drawing attention to itself. She eyed the newly planted post with the carved sign and said, "Well, it's about time someone put truth on wood around here." Jake carried in her bags as she unpacked bandages, jerky, and a tin of coffee. "You're staying then?" she asked. Jake nodded. "Feels like I've been trying to get here my whole life." Sarah gave a grunt that could have meant agreement or indigestion. Then she said, "I'll bring you old curtains next time. Cabin's starting to feel like a home. Can't have it look like a hunting shack." By nightfall, Jake and Samuel had begun clearing the barn. The dust rose like memory, clinging to the beams, the rafters, the tools left untouched for years. Jake found a rusted horseshoe mounted on the inside of the door. He left it there. Before bed, he and Ranger did their usual lap around the perimeter. Ranger's gait was slow but steady. His ears twitched with the night's whispers, his nose constantly tasting the wind. Jake spoke softly as they walked. "You've done more for me than any partner ever could," he murmured, and I've had some damn good ones. The snow underfoot was quiet. The trees stood still. Inside, Samuel lit a final lamp and sat at his desk. He pulled out Margaret's unfinished letter and added just 2 words beneath her last line. I will. Then he folded it and placed it in the drawer, not to forget, but to remember in peace. The wind howled outside, gentle now, not as a threat, but as a hymn, a song of names not lost, but honored, of spirits not vanished, but walking home. In the frozen heart of Snow Creek, what began with a wounded German shepherd limping through a storm became something far greater. Ranger didn't just find shelter. He awakened something long buried. He stirred memories in a grieving widower, gave a broken officer a reason to stand again, and lit a fire in a home that once knew only silence. In his quiet strength, he became more than a rescue dog. He became the keeper of promises, the guardian of second chances, the soul that reminded everyone that healing isn't loud, it's faithful. And maybe, in your life too, there's a ranger waiting to be found. A second chance, a door still unopened. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to remember that hope is real. Leave a comment. Let us know where you're watching from. And if you believe every soul deserves warmth, hit that subscribe button. Let's fill this world with stories that matter. May God bless you and those you love, especially the quiet ones, still waiting in the snow.